Hi, I'm Jesse Zuehlke. I'm a Science Program Manager with ILSI North America, and I'll be continuing the topic of talking about evidence-based review of an association between low-calorie sweetener intake and body weight. My first and only disclosure is that I wasn't actually involved in this project, the research of this project. The primary investigators were Dr. Paige Miller and Dr. Vanessa Perez, who at the time of the project were employed by Exponent. They've since moved on to other employers and were unfortunately unable to be here to present this work. However, the project was funded through the International Life Sciences Institute North American branch and the Technical Committee on Low-Calorie Sweeteners, and I'm here on their behalf as the Science Program Manager. So a quick outline of what we'll look at today. We'll talk a little bit about background and context, the objective, the methods used in the study, then we'll go through the results, summarize things, and then move on to a few recent developments and conclusions. So before we get started, we'll put this in a little bit of context, and this is a figure many of us have probably seen. It's from the WHO, and these are rates of adult obesity back in 2008 actually, measured by BMI. And you can see that across the globe, rates of obesity in developed and developing nations are 10, 20, and even over 30%. The other statistics that we all keep hearing are that obesity and overweight is the 5th leading risk factor for mortality, and rates have doubled since 1980. And this is due to the associated health conditions: cardiovascular disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and certain types of cancer. And so the solution, the strategy that we need to discuss is achieving and maintaining healthy weight for individuals across the globe. And this can be done through exercise, physical activity, and other lifestyle behavioral changes. And this is where low-calorie sweeteners potentially play a role. The concept of low-calorie sweeteners has actually been around for over 100 years in our food supply. And it's taken sugar-sweetened foods, or calorically sweetened foods, and substituting it with the low-calorie or non-caloric version to reduce the energy intake while preserving the food's palatability. And the concept here is to facilitate adherence to weight loss or weight maintenance plans. Now, there's actually a variety of literature on the subject, and many of it is somewhat conflicting. And this has led to several scientific consensus reports stating that there's inconclusive evidence to define a relationship between low-calorie intake and weight loss. So the objective of this study was a quantitative analysis of all results that were examining a relationship between low-calorie sweetener intake and then different metrics for overweight and obesity. And an important portion of the study in the design is that it was actually going to separate evidence from clinical studies, randomized control trials, and separate that from observational studies, prospective cohort studies. And as we know, these are two very different types of assessments, and so it was important to keep the evidence separate. As metrics for overweight and obesity, we assessed body weight, fat mass, body mass index, and waist circumference. So every meta-analysis starts with a systematic review, and the systematic review was done by searching PubMed to search the Medline database from no beginning time point to September of 2013. And it was searching for randomized control trials and prospective observational studies of humans. And the inclusion criteria, which is very important to defining the research question, was that it had to be a generally healthy population. Many of the populations were overweight or obese, but there were no acutely ill or hospitalized individuals included. There also needed to be a record of low-calorie sweetener intake and the dose of that. And then the effect of the low-calorie sweetener needed to be independently examinable. Outcomes measuring the body weight or body composition needed to be accessible, and then the durations chosen were based on previous literature of 2 weeks for randomized control trials and 6 months for observational studies. The exclusion criteria was simply that studies needed to have regulatory approval, the low-calorie sweeteners needed regulatory approval, and then they had to be low-calorie sweeteners, so provide less than 4 kilocalories per gram of energy. So we move into how the statistical analysis was performed. For the randomized control trials, random effects meta-analysis was used, and this was used rather than a fixed effects meta-analysis to account for the variability among the different studies. And this was assessing the mean change in body weight or body composition between the low-calorie sweetener intervention and the comparator arm. Subgroups of age, gender, and then the source of the low-calorie sweetener were also assessed. And then 2 or more studies were needed for the weighted group mean differences, the variability, and the heterogeneity metrics. For the prospective observational studies, still a random effects meta-analysis was used, and here t-statistics were modeled, and this allowed for synthesis of regression slopes based on a standardized metric. Subgroup, or rather metrics assessed with the prospective observational studies were body mass index and body weight, as there were fewer studies available for further subgroup analysis. And again, 2 or more studies were required for the weighted group mean, here with observational studies, correlations rather than differences. So the search strategy, as I mentioned, PubMed was used to search Medline, and 522 articles were initially identified. 429 were excluded based on the title and abstract review, leaving 93 articles, of which 19 were actually reviews or commentaries, and those were further examined just to see if any studies had initially been missed. 68 studies were then excluded based on the inclusion criteria, ultimately leaving 15 randomized control trials and 9 prospective observational studies eligible for the meta-analysis. Now this is a forest plot, I'm sorry. Mei Chung has me confused with the harvest plots. This is a forest plot, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, on the left here we have all of the studies included in the meta-analysis, and this is the randomized control trial meta-analysis of all subjects. On the right is the forest plot itself, and this is a plot of body weight. The squares represent the standardized mean difference within each study. The size is proportional to the sample size of the study, and then the horizontal line represents the 95% confidence interval. At the bottom in blue, we have the weighted group mean difference, and this is the combined standardized mean differences of all of the studies that were included. So here with randomized control trials, all subjects, we notice that most of the studies, and then the weighted mean difference is to the left of that 0 line. The 0 line in the center would represent no statistical difference. Moving to the left is favoring the low-calorie sweetener treatment. Moving to the right would be favoring the comparator treatment, or gaining weight with low-calorie sweetener intake. And so we can see that the weighted group mean difference, the summary, is a loss of 0.8 kilograms across all studies and all subjects with the low-calorie sweetener treatment. Now we can take this a step further and we can start analyzing subgroups. And so here, studies that had differentiation between adults and then differentiation between children and adolescents were also examined. And so in adults, the weighted group mean difference was a loss of 0.72 kilograms across all subjects and all studies with the low-calorie sweetener treatment. In children and adolescents, there was a loss of 1.06 kilograms across all studies and subjects, and both of these were statistically significant. The 95% confidence interval in the forest plot in the diamonds is represented by each edge of the diamond. Continuing with the subgroup analysis, and we're still looking at body weight and still in the randomized control trials, with females, we had a weighted group mean difference of a loss of 0.72 kilograms with the low-calorie sweetener treatment. And in 2 studies with males, we had a weighted group mean difference showing a loss of negative 0.09 kilograms with the low-calorie sweetener treatment. However, this was obviously not significant, statistically significant. And you notice that only 2 studies had available data for males to be assessed, and one of these was the Candor study from 1988. And I'll make a quick comment on that because it's important to the sensitivity analysis. The Candor study was actually done with obese individuals fed a balanced deficit diet. So in the males, 1,200 calories a day, and then very quick, rapid weight loss. And so a sensitivity analysis was done, removing the Candor study, and with the exception of some subgroups, there was no statistical effect of removing that study. Finally, in the randomized control trials, low-calorie sweetener source was also examined. And so here in beverages alone, there was a weighted group mean difference of a loss of 0.73 kilograms with the low-calorie sweetener treatment. When beverages, foods, and supplements potentially had low-calorie sweeteners in them, there was a weighted group mean difference of a loss of 1.11 kilograms, and this was also not statistically significant. So moving away from body weight, but still with the randomized control trials, we were also able to assess body mass index, fat mass, and waist circumference. With the body mass index, there was a weighted group mean difference of a loss of 0.24 kilograms per meter squared, and that was significant. And then with fat mass, there was a weighted group mean difference of a loss of 1.1 kilogram with the low-calorie sweetener treatment. And finally, with waist circumference, there was a weighted group mean difference loss of 0.83 centimeters with the low-calorie sweetener treatment across all studies and all subjects. So that wraps up the meta-analysis of the randomized control trials, and what we've seen is that with body weight, body mass index, fat mass, waist circumference, across a variety of subpopulations, the low-calorie sweetener treatment consistently causes a loss in the overweight and obesity metrics. Which brings us to the meta-analysis of the prospective observational studies. Here, as I mentioned, the only two metrics that were accessible were body mass index and body weight. And with body mass index on the top, you'll actually notice the weighted group mean correlation was a gain of 0.3 kilograms per meter squared with the low-calorie sweetener treatment, so the inverse effect that we saw with the clinical trials. With body weight, there was a similar gain of 0.02 kilograms, although this was not statistically significant. But again, the inverse effect that was seen with the randomized control clinical trials. So as we step back and we take that in conclusion, we looked at a meta-analysis of 15 randomized control trials, and here low-calorie sweetener intake resulted in reductions in body weight, body mass index, fat mass, and waist circumference. In the meta-analysis of 9 observational studies, low-calorie sweetener intake was not associated with body weight change, and it was actually associated with a slightly higher body mass index. Now, there are a variety of limitations with any systematic review and meta-analysis. In this particular case, with both the randomized control trials and the observational studies, there's limited information, limited evidence on specific low-calorie sweeteners, particularly polyols, sucralose, and stevia glycosides. But all low-calorie sweeteners, there's limited information on the specific sweetener. And we know that low-calorie sweeteners are a broad group of molecules, and in some cases, all they share is the ability to impact our taste receptors. In the observational study, there's also an inadequate control of baseline differences. Self-selection leads to the reverse causality argument that we frequently hear with low-calorie sweetener studies, and then the baseline differences of body weight and composition between low-calorie sweetener consumers and non-consumers not accounted for. Factors of caloric compensation and total energy intake as confounders or as potential factors are also sometimes accounted for in the study and sometimes not accounted for. So we like to address the future research needs, but this is sometimes challenging with the systematic review meta-analysis because we're looking at the evidence that exists. And so for the future research needs, and as this paper was actually published middle of last year, I thought I would bring up some of the commentary that has arisen since the manuscript was published. In the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition at the time of publication, there was an editorial, "What do you say when your patients ask whether low-calorie sweeteners help with weight management?" And this brought up an additional randomized control trial that was published after the cutoff date of this meta-analysis, stating that water was not superior to non-nutritive sweetened beverages, low-calorie sweetened beverages, for weight loss. And what was brought up in this editorial was a critical component of future research or future needs is information to healthcare professionals. The clinical evidence clearly shows that the low-calorie sweetener is associated with a reduction in body weight. However, that information is not getting to the healthcare professionals to allow it to be effectively used in the actual world, the observational studies. Several months after that, there was a letter to the editor, a question about a recent meta-analysis of low-calorie sweeteners and body weight. In this letter to the editor, they brought up a new prospective cohort study that was also published after the cutoff date of the meta-analysis. And in this prospective cohort study, they found that increasing intakes of water, coffee, and diet beverages was associated with long-term weight loss, or inversely associated with long-term weight gain. And so this is the inverse of the observational studies that we assessed, where, and more similar to the randomized control trials that the meta-analysis assessed, that the low-calorie sweetener use was associated with weight loss. This letter to the editor also brought up several questions with the search methodology. And that's a fair point with any systematic review and meta-analysis. It's important to make sure that all of the search methodology is following set standards. Cochrane's and Prisma were used for this search methodology. And the meta-analysis is actually going a step further to upload, as Mei Chung mentioned, all of the information to AHRQ Systematic Review Data Repository. So the search methodology and all of the data will be publicly available. What good would I be if I didn't mention the scientific report of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee today? The advisory committee actually used 3 systematic reviews and meta-analysis, including the current example we're discussing, to evaluate low-calorie sweetener use and body weight. And the advisory committee assigned a moderate grade for randomized control trial evidence that replacing sugar-sweetened foods and beverages with low-calorie sweetened foods and beverages would reduce caloric intake, body weight, and adiposity. However, the committee does not recommend low-calorie sweeteners as a strategy for long-term weight loss or weight maintenance. And I'll close on that clinical evidence clearly supports low-calorie sweeteners use in weight loss, weight maintenance. However, a better understanding of observational results, behavioral factors, or other potential confounders that are present in the observational studies might provide further insight into the long-term use of low-calorie sweetener to replace sugar-sweetened foods and beverages. Thank you.